Your Honour, a pre-sentence report has been prepared by the probation officer, who has had the opportunity to interview Mr. Harris, as well as communicate with the youth offending team worker. Can I check that you have the pre-sentence report? And have you had the opportunity to read it? I'm grateful. My plea to the court today is that a community order be imposed in place of a custodial sentence with a drug rehabilitation requirement and an unpaid work requirement. I'll first deal with the categorisation of the offence and then Mr. Harris's personal circumstances which are relevant to mitigation. Your Honour, Mr. Harris is under no misconception as to the seriousness of the offence with which he is charged, and to his history with the justice system, which may act against him in this regard. However, Mr. Harris has indicated a guilty plea to this offence, and the fact that this guilty plea was indicated prior to trial, I'd ask the court to give the appropriate reduction of 1/4 to any sentence imposed, in order to reflect Mr. Harris's guilty plea. Additionally, Mr. Harris's guilty plea is an indication to the court that he is aware of and ready to remedy his actions. In categorising the seriousness of the offence, I'd submit to the court that this is a lesser harm offence, in that only £15 cash was stolen from the complainant, Mr. Blake. There were credit cards and debit cards in the wallet, however, there is evidence to suggest and show that these were not used by any of the defendants and not Mr. Harris. Additionally, the wallet and the credit cards and debit cards themselves have been returned to Mr. Blake through the police, and as such the only monetary harm caused is that of the £15 cash. Further, there is no evidence of physical harm to Mr. Blake in this incident, and there is nothing to suggest that there has been any psychological harm to Mr. Blake as a result, although it is accepted that Mr. Blake was particularly frightened by this incident. However, I'd suggest that this is indeed a lesser harm offence. Your Honour, I'd also submit that this is an offence of lesser culpability, in that at no point during the commission of the offence did Mr. Harris bear, own, use or threat to use any weapon to any degree. Similarly, Mr. Harris made no verbal or physical threats during the incident, nor did he use any significant force upon Mr. Blake. In fact, Mr. Harris's role during the commission of the offence was particularly minor, and as such I submit to the court this indicates lesser culpability. As such, Your Honour, the appropriate sentence for this offence would be a range of a high community order to 3 years custody. Your Honour, this is not Mr. Harris's first interaction with the criminal justice system, but he does hope that it can be his last. And there are a number of personal circumstances and factors for the court to consider in mitigation today. You'll see from paragraphs 3.3 and 3.6 of the pre-sentence report that Mr. Harris has led a chaotic and unsettled life from a young age. He was subject to a particularly difficult family life in that his parents both misused alcohol and he was neglected due to this. He was put into care at the age of 12, he began to be bullied at school and then left all education at the age of 14. And as such, the neglect of his parents and his difficult family circumstances mean that Mr. Harris has had little guidance or support throughout his young life. This has led Mr. Harris to abuse substances, which began at the very young age of 9. This involved predominantly sniffing glue, but has escalated to his level of dependency on different substances now. You'll see from paragraph 3.1 of the pre-sentence report that the probation officer indicates that Mr. Harris's previous offending had been fuelled by his need to fund his addiction. and that this has been a controlling part of his life for quite some time. As such, Mr. Harris has struggled with the ongoing circumstances of his life, and it has only been recently that he's indicated a want to turn his life around. And I submit to the court that this change in mental attitude is a key consideration for the court today when deciding on sentence. Your Honour, there are 4 indicators I'd like to bring to the court's attention which highlight that Mr. Harris is ready to turn his life around and has newfound aspirations and motivation. The first is that Mr. Harris has undertaken voluntary work at Ground Force Project Bristol. This is something that Mr. Harris speaks very highly of and is thoroughly enjoying, and it has actually materialised that as a result of his voluntary work, Mr. Harris would like to continue this type of work on into future forms of employment. You'll see from the pre-sentence report, I believe it's paragraph 3.4, that the probation officer indicates that a secure form of employment would be key for minimising reoffending. The second point is that Mr. Harris has shown enthusiasm to completing an education. In fact, he has taken personal steps to secure a place at Hanham College for the next academic year in order to undertake and complete his GCSEs. The third point is that Mr. Harris has abstained from all substance use since being charged with this offence. Mr. Harris was charged with this offence 4 months ago, and I understand that this period of abstinence is the longest Mr. Harris has undergone so far in his life. This is a clear indication to the court that Mr. Harris now has an internal desire to get clean and to turn his life around and make a positive change. The fourth and final indicator, Your Honour, is that Mr. Harris has cut all connections with his old associates and individuals he feels were a negative influence on himself and his decision making. And as such, I'd state that in light of those, it's clear to the court that Mr. Harris has a desire to move forward with his life in a positive way. The last thing I'd like to bring to the court's attention is that since being charged with the offence, Mr. Harris has been residing with his maternal mother, and since being within that home, he has built very strong relationships both with his mother and his mother's partner, Mr. Pearce. And you'll see from the probation report that these individuals have had a stabilising effect on Mr. Harris, and in fact have had a positive impact on his view of life and his outlook for the future. And I suggest that that is a key consideration. As such, Your Honour, I'd submit to the court that custody would not be appropriate in these circumstances, in that it may interfere with these strongly built relationships and the support that they are providing Mr. Harris with. It also, custody may prevent personal progression, in that he's shown these aspirations and motivation for education and employment, and those would be interfered with if a custodial sentence was imposed. Further, as an individual who has a certain level of dependency on substance use, Mr. Harris is particularly vulnerable and has particularly acute needs, and a custodial sentence may in fact exacerbate this vulnerability. I suggested a custodial sentence would also counteract the efforts that Mr. Harris has made to detach himself from his old associates and those who have a negative impact on his decision making. And as such, I'd submit that a custodial sentence is not appropriate in these circumstances. The likelihood of reoffending has been assessed by the probation officer as medium, and I'd suggest to the court that a community order can fulfil all the needs of sentencing, in that it can restrict the offender's liberty and ability to do as he pleases, but whilst also protecting the public. As such, I'd ask the court to make a high community order in respect of Mr. Harris, including a drug rehabilitation requirement and unpaid work requirement, and that these in coexistence will help to minimise reoffending in the future. However, Your Honour, if you feel as though, in light of the aggravating factors and Mr. Harris's previous convictions, that this can only be dealt with by way of a custodial sentence, I'd ask you suspend this in order to allow Mr. Harris the opportunity to turn his life around. Unless I can be of any further assistance, those are my submissions.